This episode is brought to you by the Cornell Executive MBA MS in Healthcare Leadership, in partnership with the Weill Cornell Graduate School of Medical Sciences. The future of healthcare needs motivated and business-minded leaders who are equipped to facilitate change from within their organization and throughout the industry at large. Offered on the weekend in New York City, the Cornell Executive MBA MS in Healthcare Leadership is the only dual degree of its kind, combining business breadth and healthcare depth with world-class faculty instruction and an unmatched alumni network. Take the next step towards driving innovation in the healthcare industry by connecting with their admissions team. Search Cornell EMBA-MS to start your journey.
Welcome to the Elevate Podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your hosts, Christy Wallace and Maricela Herrera.
Hello and welcome to the Elevate Podcast. This is your host, Christy Wallace, with my co-host, Maricela Herrera. Maricela, how are you doing these days?
I'm doing well. Lots of travel in my recent past.
I know we talked about you in London, and where are you now?
Well, I had gone home before London. I'm back in New York, but I had gone home and to El Salvador, which was nice because I hadn't been home in 2.5 years. Same with London. I went to see my brother and I hadn't seen him in 2.5 years. So I'm feeling recharged and re-energized.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I know the conversation today is going to be really of interest to you, because as you're recharged and energized, it's then where do you take that and how do you continue to have that impact, that leadership, that inspiration. And our guest today, Jimena Venochea, is phenomenal. She wrote a book, Listen Like You Mean It, Reclaiming the Lost Art of True Connection. And why I'm really excited about this is we, particularly in these meetings over Zoom where you're missing the social cues, the nonverbal cues, particularly in this space where we're moving so fast and going from one thing to the next, or living in a time where there's a lot of differing opinions and thoughts and perspectives about our world, our health, our politics. The art of listening, slowing down, listening, of listening to different perspectives, of listening to what your team needs, of listening to maybe what someone's not overtly saying, but indirectly, asking for. That's an incredible power, and a power that each of us has to really not just engage with the purpose of, responding, but engaging with the purpose of listening, building on that connection. So now that you are coming back all, recharged and motivated, this is a great way for you to take that and put it into action and really create something even more magical than you already are with your teams and your communities.
I can't wait to actually listen to this. I do think it's an art that we take for granted or forget how important it is. So I'm excited. I'm excited to get some insights.
Perfect. Well, let's get to my conversation with Jimena, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on listening. It's something we just don't talk enough about. It's always about how you're communicating out, how you're advocating out, how you're, making your case and building that brand and having that voice, and all of that is important. It's also about how you listen, and you take that listening to better understand others, to help refine your thinking, and to better support those in your communities. So we'd love to hear from you. Tag Elevate Network on any social channel, #ElevatePod, and we'll see you back here next week for the Elevate Podcast.
Jimena, thank you so much for joining us today on the Elevate Podcast. I cannot wait to dive into your story and your work. So thanks for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we get into some of the recent exciting things that you've been doing, I'd love it if you would share a bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I'll start by saying that today I'm in a role that I didn't know existed until fairly recently, which is my background and training is as a user experience researcher. And I'm an author as well. And I certainly knew that being an author was an option. As a kid, I was an avid reader. I loved to write, and I was always drawn to books. I studied literature in college, and I actually thought I wanted to be a professor at a certain point. So I was in a PhD program for art history and comparative literature, and pretty quickly realized that I wasn't really meant to be in a library all day and just needed something a little more social than what that lifestyle afforded. And I spent some time working in the art world. I worked at an art gallery in Paris. I did some museum fellowships. But ultimately, I just felt like there was something else out there for me. And this was around, I guess, almost 10 years ago at this point, 2011 or so, 2012 maybe. And I started to be aware of what was happening in the technology industry and specifically in startups. And I just felt like, I'd been in academia. It felt like a very slow, sort of plodding, somewhat bureaucratic organization. And then there were startups, and there were these shiny new things, and you could move really fast. And it seemed like a place that could be a fit for someone like me. I felt like more of a generalist. I kind of wanted a hand in every honeypot and to do a lot of things. And so I turned my attention there, and wound up working at a startup in New York, an 8-person company, which no longer exists, but it was a great education in working in tech. And eventually started working at LinkedIn and then Twitter and Pinterest as a user researcher. And so a user researcher, that job basically means that you get to learn about people and their needs, their motivations, their perceptions in order to help these companies build better products. So it's probably can sound like to a lot of people that my career path makes no sense. I've gone from writing to working in the art world to working in tech. But actually, for me, there's a really clear through line, which is that what I've always been interested in, whether it was through literature or a piece of art or technology, was really understanding people and their stories. And understanding their innermost thoughts, but in a passage in a book, or having a conversation with them to understand what they're thinking and feeling, which is what I've been able to do through my job in the tech industry. And so my book is kind of a culmination of that interest, which is really in getting to know people through the art of conversation and listening.
So clearly that is something I'm passionate about, and something I've learned a lot about through this podcast is listening, right? And that intent to listen and not to respond, which I think is not a normal human response. We're kind of always listening with like, what am I going to say next? Or how do I respond to this? And, through the podcast and the storytelling, I just have to lean into that listening. But, I love that idea of writing about this and sharing those insights, because I'm not sure that we do listen like we mean it. And what was that process like for you to really, create this work that you're sharing with the world?
Yeah, I think you're right in that most of us in general are not actively thinking about our listening very often. We're sort of more often just showing up in a conversation and thinking, okay, our ears will do the rest. And you can hear enough of a conversation in that state to nod and smile, be polite, keep the job, not totally lose control of what's happening. But when we are able to tap into a deeper level of listening, we're able to connect much more deeply with people. And that was something that, there were sort of two reasons that I felt like this was the right time to take on this project. One was we're in this moment where we are, most of us, feeling pretty disconnected from each other. Part of that is the pandemic, this physical disconnection that exists. But I would argue that that was even happening beforehand, just given where we are culturally, politically. There's a lot of polarization, and it can feel hard to have deep conversations with people. And then the other part is that I started noticing in my everyday world, when I was tuning into how's my listening going? Am I really actively listening right now? I realized that I was much better able to read a room, understand what was happening in a meeting, decipher the power dynamics that maybe were not explicit, but if I paid attention, I could see them. Understand when, a direct report had more to say. They weren't quite finished, even though it seemed like they were finished. And so I just became much more aware of what was going on for other people. And I think that made me much more productive, but also just better connected to my colleagues, my friends, my family as a result. And so it felt like a really important skill to help share with others. And I think I was also encouraged by the fact that it was a skill set that I had learned. That's one of the main tools in your toolbox as a user researcher is listening. And so there is a craft and there is a technique. And that's what I was being exposed to and starting to harness. And it just felt like this could be really helpful for more than just, user researchers, for everybody.
Can you talk more about that craft and that technique? I mean, what should we be paying attention to, or things that we should be doing, steps we should be taking to be better listeners? And also as we, head into a time where, to your point, kind of a lot of the cues and things that listening is not always just with your ears. It's with all of the different cues and nonverbal and other aspects that are happening within a room and a conversation. And I think during COVID, we've had to, we learn in some ways, like how to pay attention, or how, not pay attention, but how to listen as everything is in this virtual space. And so as we head back into, seeing people in person and having those types of conversations, what are the tools in your toolbox that we should be intentional about leveraging, and how should we approach this new time and space in a much more intentional way?
So I think when it comes to, transitioning to this next phase, whatever you want to call it, since I feel like we've been sort of teased with when we're reentering normalcy at this stage, but when that day comes where we're, really truly hanging out in person or having meetings in person, I think that one of the most important things is to relieve some of the pressure that I think many of us are carrying into those conversations. So we're often kind of talking them up like, oh God, I forget what to say. I forget how to have a conversation. This is so awkward. I think just letting the conversation be what it needs to be is really important. I also think that demonstrating curiosity is a great starting point. So if you feel like you might have that kind of cold start problem in a conversation where you don't know how to get started, demonstrating curiosity is one of the best things you can do. There's actually research that's been shown that it's less about, telling a good story that draws somebody in, or sounding impressive that draws someone in. It's more about demonstrating that you're interested in them. So it's being interested rather than interesting. And so if you can remember that and ask open-ended questions, for example, questions that start with how or what as opposed to do, is, or are, those are going to open up the conversation in a really nice way. And then the other thing I would say is that it's important to be aware of what I call your default listening mode. So your default listening mode is just the way that you naturally, intuitively listen in conversation. And each of us has a specific mode, and it's informed by our early relationships, in part by our personality. There's no good mode, there's no bad mode, they're all great. But sometimes our mode isn't necessarily what's needed. And so if I'm someone who has a problem-solving listening mode, that means that I'm constantly scanning for what is the problem that this person has? How can I help solve it? Right? So that makes me prone to responding by, for example, giving advice, which can be helpful if that's really what the person is looking for, but can also be not helpful and potentially even damaging if, for example, that person feels like, hey, I've got this. Why are you giving me advice? Now I feel micromanaged, I feel doubted, etc. So we want to really be careful with what mode we're bringing into conversation. And I think especially as we emerge into this next phase where, for example, you may have a great appetite for a certain line of questioning, and you may be hearing things and thinking, oh, like they want to talk about X. And I think just giving the conversation space to breathe is really important, because we've all had such different versions of this pandemic that someone may not want to, go into details about how everything's been going. Sometimes the best thing that we can do is just to bear witness. just to listen and give the person the space to share as much or as little of their experience that they're ready to share.
Is silence okay in a conversation?
Absolutely. And I think we tend to forget this. I think that we culturally, we think of silence as a bad thing. There's a reason we call it an awkward silence. We don't like it. It makes us uncomfortable. But why does it make us uncomfortable? Usually it makes us uncomfortable because we start to experience some level of doubt of, oh gosh, have I said something that's offended the other person or bored the other person? Or did I totally miss what we were talking about here? And I responded in a way that wasn't appropriate. Like it's loaded, right? But actually it doesn't have to be. Those are our own projections onto the conversation. Silence can also mean that the other person is thinking through something, they're processing, they may be working their way up to sharing something with you. Maybe there's something that's hard to articulate. Maybe it's emotionally heavy and they're working their way slowly toward that. It doesn't have to mean anything about us. It can also actually mean that there's great comfort in the relationship if you can sit in silence for a moment. So I would recommend to listen for those opportunities where there is a little bit of silence. And instead of following that often knee jerk reaction of, oh, let me rush in and change the topic and the conversation, ask a question, move things along, just to sort of sit with that silence and see what happens. Because more often than not, what's going to happen is that the other person will share something. And it might be something unexpected or surprising that if you had come in to quote unquote save the day, save the conversation, you might never have actually gotten access to.
Yeah, I love that. What about, I guess the opposite of silence, which is, the takers or the people who kind of really control or dominate a conversation, so it doesn't feel as two-sided and collaborative. How do you navigate that and try and steer the conversations into more of a two-way collaboration?
It's a good question because I think we all have at least one person in our lives who kind of fits this bill of taking more than maybe they return in a conversation. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably also played that role for someone else at least once or twice. So it's a very natural and human thing to do, right? To want to speak and contribute in conversation, but we can also miss that, the other person has something to say too. So in that case, if you have, a coworker who has this habit or a friend or whomever it may be, I think there's two things to think about. The first is this a pattern or is this a one-off? If this is a one-off, maybe that person is having, a particularly tough time. They really need to vent. I think it's okay if it's uneven from time to time. It's sort of like when you are close friends with someone and you go out for a round of drinks at happy hour and you say, I'll get you this time, you'll get me next time, right? There's sort of an understanding that, okay, this person needs to vent this time. I'm going to get my space next time. But if it's a pattern where it's consistently happening in a given relationship, I think then it's worth thinking about, is this someone who it makes sense to begin to set a boundary with in my life? That boundary can happen within a conversation or within a relationship. So, for example, if this is someone who there's not a sort of blood tie or marital tie or job tie, you might decide, wow, this friend is maybe not as good of a friend as I thought. I've tried potentially bringing this up to them. I think I'm going to distance myself from them. I don't want to be, that sort of like receiving vessel for them. And I don't think they can change. I think it's okay to, after you've really considered it, begin to distance yourself from them. However, there are other people in your lives who that's not an option, right? Maybe it's your boss and you can't just walk away from that relationship. And so this is where I think setting a boundary within a conversation becomes really important. And what I mean by that is being able to exit a conversation, to have your time be respected in a conversation. So, for example, maybe there's a colleague who, conversations always run late and that person tends to kind of take all your advice, and there's never really much time for you to ask anything in return. So maybe the next time you have that one-on-one, you pick I guess when we're back in the office, you pick a conference room, let's say, that has quick turnover. So it's a very busy conference room. Instead of, for example, going to the cafeteria where no one's ever going to kick you out. Or you can do the same with a restaurant versus a cafe, right? You're looking for settings that have sort of built-in guardrails. That's a discrete way of giving a specific amount of time to the person. You can also tell the person up front. This is what I call time boxing. You can say, I'm so excited to chat about X. I only have 20 minutes, but I'm all yours until then. So you're telling them up front, this is what I can offer you, which can be very useful for the other person, especially if they do have a tendency to kind of ramble or meander their way to making a point. And then you can also learn how to exit a conversation. And to do that gracefully doesn't need to mean that you're being rude. You can say something like, it was so great to chat with you about this. I have to run. You can provide a reason for why. You can say, I have a meeting I need to go to, or not. I don't think that it necessarily matters how much specificity you give the other person, so long as you are being upfront about what you're able to contribute and when you need to peel back. I think it gets harder when we try and power through, which is why I really recommend, even though it's uncomfortable at times, just to practice saying, this was great. Thank you. It was great catching up. I'm going to let you go now, or I have to run now, whatever it may be.
Well, I mean, and talking about those hard situations, and you started earlier when you were sharing kind of the times in which we're living and the times in which you wrote this book, because I think many of us have been in some tough conversations with family, friends, maybe coworkers. If it's, how to manage a team, or how to, someone you're managing, the ways you want them to communicate or show up during a time when maybe we're all struggling. If it's politics or Black Lives Matter, and you hope we live in a world where we're all aligned and on the same page and open to listening. But that's not the reality of the world in which we're in. And so during these tough conversations, how do we listen better? And I've been on the receiving end of a conversation where I just want to just tune them out and be like, no, I don't hear you. But, make space to listen, but then also help guide that other person in listening to our perspective as well.
Sure. I mean, I think with difficult conversations in particular, one of the most important things is to set an intention and be really explicit about it. And so part of setting an intention is a useful reminder for you, even though you may have good intentions, but a reminder of, okay, what am I trying to accomplish in this difficult conversation? But also for the other person. And so that can sound like, hey, I'm hoping we could talk about XYZ topic. I know that this might bring up some strong feelings. Please know that my intention here is really just to understand you. And I do think that's important, that the intent is to understand, as opposed to, for example, change someone's mind or convince or argue or debate our point of view. And I think in order to do that, that requires humility, which is just absolutely crucial for these types of conversations. Because if I come into a conversation thinking that I have all the answers, that my opinion is the right one, or that I have the facts and the other person doesn't, it's going to be very hard to make a connection with that person. But if I set that aside and say, okay, I have my experience, I have my opinions, what can I learn from this other person? Even if what I learn is that they're really different from me, I want to know why. And so I think setting that intention of, I'm here to learn, I'm here to understand you, and really internalizing that, and reminding ourselves that we're not always the expert in the conversation, that this person we're talking to is the expert in their own lives, and we can be a student in those teachings of getting to know them. I think that is sort of number one before you even go into a conversation. The other thing I would add once you're in the conversation is that it's really important to be aware of what is happening for you physically and emotionally in the moment. So especially when it's a sort of a hot button topic where we have strong opinions about something, and especially when those opinions are informed by our values, our belief system, or personal experiences, it can start to feel really personal, even if what the other person is saying isn't intended to feel personal. So I think it's really important to tune into, oh, what am I feeling in my body? Oh, that's interesting. My throat is starting to tighten a little bit. Oh, my chest is, I'm breathing a little bit faster than I usually do. Ooh, I'm clenching my fists. I didn't even realize that. Tuning into that can be really useful because often it can be hard in the moment to tune into what's happening emotionally because our brain is just rationalizing everything. We're sort of like keying up our response. But if you feel what's happening in your body first, then that's a useful signal that, okay, some kind of boundary, some kind of line has been crossed for me personally. And that's a great moment to either say to the other person, you know what? I realize I'm having a really emotional response to what you're saying, and I'm having trouble hearing you. Is it okay if we take a 5-minute break or come back to this tomorrow? That is so useful to share with the other person. Chances are the other person's going to say, oh, sure. And I think we often have a tendency to just power through instead. And really what happens when we power through is we get more upset. And that's when, maybe eventually we blow up or we think, this is hopeless. Why am I even trying to have this conversation? So I think that would be my advice, setting that intention going into the conversation, then being really aware of what's happening for you and being willing to hit pause if you need to.
Great advice, and thank you for that. And something I think we all can learn so much from and take so much away from. I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit and get to know you a bit more. And if you don't mind, I'm going to do a little speed round and ask you some questions. So, are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I would say I'm an ambivert. I feel like I'm right on the line. I have extroverted tendencies and introverted tendencies.
And what's your favorite day of the week?
I like Wednesdays. It breaks things up.
Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Definitely an early bird.
Have you always been an early bird? I'm
I have
so curious about how our patterns have shifted.
I have definitely always been an early bird. Yeah.
Who would be your dream dinner guest?
I think I would go with my great aunt. She passed away a couple of years ago and I didn't get a chance to say goodbye and I was close to her. So that would be really lovely.
Do you have any pet peeves?
Gendered feedback.
Oh, yes. We could have a whole other conversation about that. But yeah, which also is critically important as we talk about communication.
Mm-hmm.
What is your morning must have, what you need to get your day started?
I've started to not get out of bed until I mentally think about what do I want to achieve today? Not, what does my team want or what does my partner want or whoever is in my inbox, but what is one thing that I want to achieve today? And that's been really clarifying.
Do you have a favorite recent read?
I really loved How to Deal from Grace Misali. It's an illustrated book, and I just think it's perfect for these times. It's really just about how to navigate tough times. So I would recommend that.
What's your top self-care practice?
Walking and good conversation.
Both things I greatly appreciate as well. And a final thought you want to leave with our listeners today?
I think I would say that just for folks who feel like they are either intuitively good at listening or not, I think there's an assumption that listening isn't something that you can necessarily learn, that it's sort of like you either have it or you don't. And I would really want to challenge that because I think that there are some tactical skills and techniques that you can learn to improve your listening skills in the same way that we invest in public speaking and presentation skills. So if you're on the fence, if you're not sure, I think, that's what my book is really trying to do is break down what are the steps and how to guide you to being a better listener.
All right. And then on that note, Jimena, how do we get your book?
Oh, it is available wherever books are sold. So wherever your favorite bookstore is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the Elevate podcast. And I encourage everyone to check it out. I think we can all put some work into being better listeners and seeing the impact in our lives and in our families, our communities, and most importantly in our workplaces. And as we, head back into the office, just going back with the intention of being a better listener and how that shows up for your teams and your company. It's all incredibly important. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Elevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Elevate podcast on iTunes, give us 5 stars, and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at ElevateNTWK, that's Elevate Network, and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Elevate Network is doing at our website, www.elevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.